She stood at the altar in ceremonial white, dressed in silk and silver, waiting for the man she loved to speak her name. The great dining hall of the Obsidian Palace had been arranged to resemble a high court of judgment. Its vaulted stone ceilings disappeared into the cavernous rafters. Shadows clung there like thick cobwebs. Hundreds of tall white pillar candles burned fiercely along the marble colonnades. Their erratic light cast distorted shapes against the ancient tapestries. Murals woven into heavy fabric depicted centuries of sovereign wolves conquering the northern territories through blood and absolute loyalty. Tonight the air in the hall was suffocating, thick with the scent of melted beeswax, polished steel, and the heavy, anxious weight of unspoken rumors. The entire assembly of the nobility stood shoulder to shoulder across the expansive floor, locked in absolute silence. No one dared whisper to their neighbor. No one dared breathe. They were waiting for the Alpha King. Elena Silverwood did not fidget. She stood perfectly still at the center of the dais. Her pale hands remained hidden within the cascading folds of her pristine gown. The fabric felt less like a garment of celebration and more like a burial shroud. At the base of her throat, resting heavily against her delicate collarbone, the silver crescent pandon felt unnaturally cold. The ancestral metal absorbed the icy chill of the massive room rather than the natural warmth of her skin. It was the irrefutable mark of her position, the physical, historical proof that she belonged to him. Her claiming mark, deep beneath her ribs, the biological bond connecting her soul to the sovereign pulsed, a low, frantic thrum. It was a warning, a visceral instinct vibrating through her veins, whispering of danger. She ignored the dull ache in her chest. She kept her chin raised. Her grey eyes, as quiet and deep as a winter storm, remained fixed on the massive iron-wrought doors at the far end of the hall. The heavy iron hinges groaned, sharp and ominous. The sound cracked the quiet cathedral space like a fracturing glacier. A violent gust of wind swept into the chamber. It instantly extinguished a dozen torches. The temperature plummeted. The king had arrived. King Soren Valerius stepped over the threshold. The Alpha King of the Obsidian Court moved with the terrifying, fluid grace of an apex predator. His mere presence was a tangible weight. It pressed down upon the lungs of every lesser wolf in the room, forcing them to lower their gazes in biological submission. He wore ceremonial black. The dark velvet of his cloak absorbed the dim light. The golden lichen crest gleamed violently upon his broad chest. The intricate gold metalwork caught the candlelight, serving as a glaring symbol of his unquestionable authority over the territory. His molten amber eyes swept over the silent crowd, calculating, hard. He did not look at his wife. He was not alone. The air had turned to glass in her lungs. A woman walked proudly beside the sovereign. Her delicate fingers were woven intimately through the king's battle-scarred hand. Lady Cynthia Blackwood, the manipulative ghost that had haunted the edges of their marriage, since the very moment the bond had first snapped into place, like a key turning in a lock. Cynthia wore a gown of midnight velvet, a direct, mocking contrast to the stark white silk draped over the lawful queen. The dark fabric hugged her curves. A smile of pure, venomous triumph played on her painted lips. As she stepped deeper into the room, she carried the distinct scent of poisoned honey and night-blooming jasmine. It was an abomination, a cloying sweetness that immediately choked out the crisp, natural pine scent of the winter court. Soren led his companion up the center aisle. He paraded her past the bowing lords. He guided her past the wide-eyed ladies of the inner circle. He marched her directly toward the elevated high dais where his rightful mate waited in total stillness. The magical bond inside Elena's chest convulsed. A sharp, burning spike of pure physical rejection lanced through her ribs. It tasted like copper in the back of her throat. She did not gasp. She did not sway on her feet. She locked her knees under the heavy layers of silk and forced her lungs to expand. In. Out. Keep breathing. The entire assembly watched the public humiliation unfold with bated breath. The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her. They waited eagerly for the quiet girl to finally shatter. They expected her delicate shoulders to shake. They expected tears to ruin her pale cheeks. She did none of those things. The Alpha King ascended the polished marble steps. He did not release the interloper's hand. He stood tall, his angular jaw set with an arrogant conviction, The golden royal emblem rose and fell with his steady breaths. He finally turned his head and met his mate's gaze. There was no hesitation in his expression, no trace of apology in those glowing amber eyes. There was only the cold, unyielding demand of a sovereign accustomed to absolute obedience from every creature beneath the moon. The court will bear witness. Sorin's voice boomed, rattling the glass in the high windows. It was a terrifying command, devoid of affection. The Obsidian Court requires undeniable strength. It requires a legacy secured by those who truly understand the immense political weight of the crown. Effective immediately, Lady Cynthia shall take her place at my right side. She is to be formally recognized as the secondary Luna of this territory. The collective gasp of the nobility rippled through the massive space. 500 witnesses, 500 pairs of eyes darting frantically between the untouchable ruler and the silent woman standing alone in white. To take a second mate was an archaic practice. A brutal insult historically reserved only for the barren, the treacherous, or the fundamentally broken. It was a public execution of her dignity. Cynthia leaned closer to the powerful man, her dark velvet shoulder intentionally brushing his chest. She looked down her nose at the pale, motionless woman before them. Her eyes glittered with dark amusement as she waited for the inevitable, pathetic collapse. Sorin took a half-step forward, his massive frame towering over his wife. He expected her to fall to her knees. He anticipated hysterical weeping, the desperate grasping at the hem of his dark cloak, the broken pleading for him to reconsider her rightful place. He was fully prepared to offer her a condescending sliver of pity. To gently explain that this cruelty was simply for the good of the Pax Alliances, he waited for her to beg for his mercy. Silence, absolute, deafening, heavy. Elena looked directly at the man who had claimed her soul. She let her gaze drift down to the large hand, securely holding another woman's delicate fingers. The searing, agonizing heat of the mate bond suddenly stopped. It did not fade. It did not linger. It severed with a sickening internal snap. It left behind a massive cavity of freezing, absolute numbness, neither a tool nor a possession, but an independent will. The words echoed in the hollow, icy space of her mind. A mistake is when you do not know what you are doing. A choice is when you do, and you do it anyway. He had made his choice with full clarity. She did not scream at the injustice. She did not argue with the sovereign. With a deliberate, agonizingly smooth grace, the discarded queen raised her hands. Her slender fingers, perfectly steady, reached for the back of her neck. Sorin's thick brow furrowed. A sudden flicker of confusion broke his arrogant facade. He growled, the sound dropping from a king's decree to a low, dangerous rumble. "What are you doing?" She ignored him entirely. Her fingers found the mechanism. The intricate silver clasp gave way with a soft click. Elena lowered her hands. The heavy silver crescent pandon now rested coldly in her open palm. The ancient metal looked dead in the candlelight. The delicate chain dangled between her fingers like a broken, useless shackle. Without uttering a single syllable, without shedding a single tear, she stepped forward. She moved smoothly past the towering Alpha King. She did not spare a glance for Cynthia. She did not look out at the sea of gaping nobles. She walked directly to the empty, ornate chair beside the king's, the seat that was supposed to be hers for the rest of her natural life. Gently, almost reverently, she laid the ancient necklace upon the dark velvet cushion. The metal made no sound as it settled into the fabric, yet the absolute finality of the quiet gesture echoed louder than a thunderclap. She turned her back on the throne. She turned her back on the king. Her expression remained completely devoid of sorrow. Her eyes were as calm, desolate, and unforgiving as a frozen lake in the dead of winter. The rustle of white silk dragging against the cold stone floor was the only sound left in the world. Elena walked down the marble steps of the dais, her posture impossibly straight. She moved with an inherent regal dignity that no political title could ever bestow, and no public betrayal could ever strip away. The dense sea of nobility parted instantly before her. Lords and ladies scrambled awkwardly out of her path, pressing themselves tightly against the pillars, their heads bowed involuntarily, forced down by the sheer, terrifying weight of her absolute silence. They had dressed in their finest clothes to watch a weak Omega be crushed. Instead, they were witnessing the quiet, terrifying burial of a king's honor. At the far end of the hall, standing rigidly before the massive wooden exit doors, was Commander Garrick Thorne. The seasoned warrior stood like a statue in his dark armor. He had served the royal estate faithfully his entire life. He knew the strict laws of the Alpha. He knew his sworn duty was to step forward and physically block the doors if his sovereign commanded it. "Stop her!" Soren's voice cracked like a violent whip from the front of the hall. The order was laced with heavy, suffocating Alpha authority. A raw power heavy enough to drive lesser wolves to their knees. Garrick did not move to intercept the fleeing woman. As the figure in white approached the threshold, the scarred commander looked directly into her face. He saw the shattered, frozen remains of the bond in her eyes. He saw the absolute, irreversible ashes of her loyalty. Defying the punishing aura of his furious king, the old soldier took a deliberate step backward. He placed a heavy armored fist over his heart and bowed deeply, his chin tucked respectfully toward his breastplate. Behind him, the elite royal guards immediately followed suit. 10 lethal warriors dropped to one knee in the shadows, offering their silent, absolute respect to the queen, who was walking away with nothing but the clothes on her back. Elena stepped past the kneeling soldiers without hesitation. She pushed her weight against the heavy side doors and walked out into the unforgiving night. The storm hit her instantly. A torrential downpour was battering the outer courtyard. The freezing rain turned to sleet as it struck the ancient cobblestones. Frigid water soaked completely into her ceremonial gown within seconds. It mercilessly plastered the ruined white silk to her shivering skin. The icy deluge washed away the cloying scent of poisoned honey that lingered in her nose. It washed away the suffocating smell of the treacherous palace. The brutal wind howled from the direction of the whispering woods, biting into her bones, violently welcoming her into the dark unknown. She did not look back. Inside the suffocating hall, Soren stood frozen on the elevated dais. His large hand was still half raised toward the distant doors that had just swung shut against the storm. Suddenly, a violent, crushing pressure clamped down mercilessly around his ribs. He stared after her retreating figure, gripped by the sudden, horrific illusion that his very soul had just slipped through the doors. The bizarre sensation was utterly suffocating. A physical sickening tearing deep within the marrow of his bones. He gritted his teeth, his jaw locking as he forced the inexplicable weakness down into his stomach. He buried the pain under thick, heavy layers of wounded pride. He dropped his raised hand to his side. He scoffed. The sound was harsh and deliberately dismissive in the deathly quiet room. She had absolutely nothing. No money, no pack backing, no physical protection from the harsh, lethal winter elements. The wild expanse of the cursed forest would break her spirit before dawn let her go. The sovereign announced loudly, turning his broad back to the doors. He casually adjusted his heavy black cloak, refusing to rub the strange deep ache blossoming over his sternum. The storm will freeze the useless rebellion out of her system. She will crawl back to these gates, begging for warmth within 3 days. He believed it completely. As he looked at the quiet, empty throne beside him, the arrogant king had no idea. He did not know that the discarded silver chain resting on the velvet would be the very last piece of her he would ever be permitted to touch. The freezing rain turned to heavy, blinding snow the deeper the exiled woman walked into the tree line. The whispering woods did not welcome intruders. Ancient pines towered like blackened sentinels against the night sky. Their thick branches blocked the pale moonlight entirely, plunging the forbidden territory into an oppressive abyss. The wind screamed through the canopy. It tore at the ruined white silk of her ceremonial gown, shredding the delicate fabric against jagged thorns and grasping branches. She did not stop walking. Her bare feet bled against the sharp stones hidden beneath the accumulating frost. The ice bit into her skin. Her toes were numb. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the massive, hollow cavity echoing inside her ribcage. The air had turned to glass in her lungs. The severed mate bond was a restless ghost. It felt like an amputated limb that still throbbed with a phantom ache, pumping blood into a necrotic void every time her heart beat. But Elena Silverwood refused to reach out for the missing connection. The wall inside her chest is gone. She has not built another. Instead of constructing a fortress against the grief, She simply let the freezing emptiness flood her veins. Let the cold claim what Soren had broken. The forest floor was a graveyard of fallen autumn leaves and brittle bone. Lesser wolves would have succumbed to the dropping temperatures within the first hour. They would have curled beneath a massive root, shivering uncontrollably, and let the frost claim their lungs. She did not. She kept her chin raised. The deeper the former Luna ventured into the shadows, the more the biting cold seemed to recognize her quiet presence. The winds began to shift. They softened into low, mournful breezes that curled around her shivering shoulders like a protective cloak. The wild expanse was not trying to break her. It was testing her right to exist within its borders. Hours bled into an indistinguishable stretch of darkness before the tree line finally broke. She stumbled into a sunken clearing shielded by vertical walls of dark slate, a natural sanctuary. At the center of the natural fortress stood the hollowed roots of a petrified weir tree. The cavernous space beneath the silver wood offered protection from the winter elements. She collapsed to her knees on the hard earth. Her bleeding fingers clawed at the moss, dragging handfuls of the green vegetation into the hollow to form a crude nest. She had no money. She had no pack backing. She had no warm hearth to retreat to. But as she curled her exhausted body into the dark earth, a profound peace settled over her trembling frame, the first true peace she had known in years. There is no wolf too broken to be worthy. The ancient thought bloomed in the freezing dark. The sickening scent of melted beeswax and poisoned honey was gone. Here there was only the crisp scent of crushed pine needles, raw dirt, and her own stubborn survival. She closed her eyes. The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her. Everyone expected her to crumble, to weep, to beg. She did none of those things. The outcast simply slept. The silence of the clearing was not empty. It was alive. The ambient magic of the forbidden territory hummed beneath the frost, a low vibration that resonated directly with the dormant power sleeping deep within her blood. For years, the strict hierarchy of the Obsidian Palace had demanded she suppress her true nature. They had demanded an invisible omega. This sanctuary demanded nothing. The bleeding scratches along her pale arms began to slowly knit together. It was a quiet healing independent of any alpha's commanding aura. The cold earth absorbed her sorrow. It replaced the humiliation of the royal court with clarity. A tiny golden spark flickered deep within her soul. Unbound, unmastered, and entirely free, 3 days passed. The stone fortress had not recovered its natural rhythm. The vaulted halls of the Obsidian Palace felt dim. The heavy air was thick with unspoken dread. Inside the royal bedchamber, the massive stone fireplace roared with blinding heat. Servants had piled thick oak logs until the flames licked the blackened chimney. Yet the sovereign could not stop shivering. King Soren Valerius sat heavily on the edge of his velvet mattress. His broad shoulders hunched forward. He watched the flames. He carried the posture of a monarch who had voluntarily amputated his own spirit. A spasm ripped through his chest. He coughed. It was a harsh, rattling sound that tasted like metallic ash. His large hand clutched his sternum. His thick fingers dug ruthlessly into the solid muscle, as if trying to physically tear the rotting sensation out of his failing body. The sacred space where the mate bond used to burn with golden warmth was now a decaying chasm. A slow, spiritual gangrene was creeping into his veins. It was poisoning his untouchable strength. Soren gasped for air. His lungs felt lined with shattered glass. The heavy oak door clicked open. A delicate pair of hands slipped over his trembling shoulders. Lady Cynthia Blackwood pressed her warm body against his rigid back. The suffocating scent of night-blooming jasmine and poisoned honey washed over him. It was meant to be intoxicating. Instead, it made his stomach churn with biological nausea. "Drink this, my lord," she murmured. Her voice dripped with calculated sweetness. It grated against his sensitive hearing. Cynthia offered a polished silver goblet, filled with a dark medicinal tonic. "The blizzard has made you restless. Her foolish tantrum will end soon enough. You must preserve your strength." The king took the cup with a shaking hand, but his glowing amber eyes remained fixed on the tall vanity mirror. The reflection staring back at him was horrifying. The powerful Alpha King was deteriorating. The skin around his eyes had hollowed out entirely, bruised with sickly purple shadows. His hand made the heavy goblet tremble in his grip. Unnatural streaks of dead, ashen grey had begun to spiderweb rapidly through his pitch-black locks. The physical toll of the severed soul connection was draining his life force. He had thought forcing her to abandon the silver crescent pendon would break her spirit. He never calculated that her sudden absence would literally shatter his own biological foundation. A mistake occurs in moments of ignorance, but a deliberate choice requires full awareness, and he had chosen cruelty. The intrusive memory of his discarded wife's quiet philosophy echoed relentlessly in his mind. He shoved Cynthia away. The silver goblet crashed against the cold stone floor. The dark liquid spilled across the expensive rug like ruined blood. His companion gasped. She stumbled backward toward the door in shock. His breathing grew shallow, ragged. The supreme ruler of the black stone fortress was suffocating inside his own bedroom. Desperation breeds paranoia. By the dawn of the fourth agonizing day, the ailing king could no longer pretend the rebellion would freeze out of the outcast system. The crushing pressure in his chest demanded action. He summoned the head of his elite royal warriors to the great hall. Commander Garrick Thorne stood rigidly before the throne. His weathered face was devoid of expression. The duty-bound commander had tracked rogue wolves across the deadliest northern glaciers. He was fearless in the face of the harshest elements. "Find her," Sorin commanded. His voice was a raw, gravelly rasp. It betrayed his failing strength. "Take the northern ridge. Drag her back to these gates if you must, but do not dare return empty-handed." Garrick bowed low. The dark leather of his armor creaked loudly in the heavy silence. The journey to the edge of the forbidden territory took less than an hour. Garrick moved like a silent shadow through the biting morning frost. The relentless snowfall erased his deep footprints almost instantly. As he approached the jagged tree line of the Whispering Woods, the atmospheric pressure dropped. The freezing air grew thin. It stole the breath directly from his lungs. A heavy silver fog rolled out from between the ancient pine trunks. It smelled of ozone and electrified earth. The seasoned commander immediately drew his silver-coated blade. His sharp survival instincts screamed at him to halt his advance. The woods were entirely silent. No birds chirped in the canopy. No rustling wind moved the branches. Just a dead, suffocating quiet. Then the ambient temperature plummeted. From the thick mist, massive silhouettes began to materialize. Garrick froze in his tracks. His breath plumed in jagged white clouds. They were not ordinary beasts. Ancient, phantom wolf spirits stepped out of the shadows. Their ethereal bodies were composed of swirling silver mist and glowing gold light. The apparitions stood twice as tall as any mortal shifter. Their eyes burned with a primal judgment that pinned the soldier to the frozen ground. They did not attack. They simply formed an impenetrable wall of ancient magic across the unmarked border. A low, synchronized growl vibrated through the earth. It shook the frost from the branches. It rattled the teeth inside the commander's skull. It was a clear warning from the heart of the forest itself. The discarded queen was no longer unprotected. She had been claimed by the wild. Garrick slowly lowered his weapon. His calloused hands trembled against the leather hilt. He knew with absolute certainty that taking one step into the mist would result in his execution. Defeated, the loyal soldier took a slow step backward. The phantom wolf spirits watched him retreat in silence. Their glowing golden eyes burned into his memory. The king's orders meant nothing against the awakened magic of the earth. The exiled mate was untouchable. Deep within the heart of the Whispering Woods, the night sky began to bleed. A massive blood moon crested over the jagged canopy, casting a visceral crimson glow across the petrified weir trees. It was a celestial event that had not been witnessed in the Northern Territories for over 3 centuries. The freezing temperature plummeted further, snapping ancient branches under the weight of the sudden unnatural frost. Yet inside the sunken sanctuary, the air grew inexplicably thick, heavy, suffocating with ancient anticipation. Elena Silverwood lay curled within her makeshift nest of moss and pine needles. The damp earth smelled of centuries of decay and rebirth. Her breathing was shallow, her pale skin ghostly under the red moonlight that filtered through the skeletal branches above. The brutal ghost of her severed connection to the Obsidian Palace still clawed at her ribcage. It was a parasitic ache, a desperate, dying tug from a man who had publicly discarded her in front of an entire royal court. For 3 days, she had endured the agonizing withdrawal of the mate bond. It felt like pulling rusted nails from her own heart, but the wild earth beneath her shivering body had absorbed her silent grief. It had drank the tears she refused to shed. Now it was demanding its toll. The ambient magic of the forbidden territory did not just hum anymore. It roared. The vibration started deep within the bedrock, shaking the loose frost from the blackened trunks. It traveled upward, vibrating through the solid stone of her natural fortress. The primal energy seeped into the exiled woman's bleeding bare feet, rushing through her frostbitten veins like liquid fire. Elena gasped, a sharp intake of air that tasted of raw ozone and electrified earth. Her spine arched off the hard dirt, her hands clenched into fists, digging desperately into the frozen soil. Her eyes snapped open. The pale, quiet grey of her irises had been swallowed entirely by a blinding molten gold. The transformation did not begin with pain. It began with absolute, searing liberation. For years, the oppressive hierarchy of the royal court had forced her to shrink. They had demanded a submissive, invisible Omega. They had placed a silver collar of propriety around her neck and expected her to choke on it in silence. She remembered the cold marble floors of the palace. She remembered the sneers of the noblewomen, the dismissive glances of the elders who deemed her bloodline worthless. But the ancient energy flooding her system now recognized no king, no alpha, no master. She was no longer a pawn. She was the master of her own fate. The agonizing tether of the rejected mate bond, that rotting, black thread connecting her soul to King Sorin Valerius, suddenly materialized in her mind's eye. It was a suffocating chain pulling her toward the past. Before the fire entirely consumed her, she felt the familiar, pathetic pull of the distant sovereign. It was a weak, fading tug against her heart, demanding she return to her humiliation. She felt his arrogance across the miles of snow. He still believed he owned her. He still believed her silence was merely a tactic to garner political sympathy. Caring about you is killing me. The whispered realization floated through the freezing air as she finally let go of the last shred of her human attachment. She had spent her entire youth trying to be small enough to fit into his grand world. She was done shrinking. She severed the final emotional anchor with brutal precision. That was the exact moment the crimson moonlight pierced her chest. With a single defiant thought powered by the wild magic of the blood moon, she shattered the connection entirely. I reject this bond. The words were not spoken aloud. They reverberated through the marrow of her bones, an absolute decree of the soul. The physical reaction was catastrophic and beautiful. A shockwave of pure, golden light erupted from her frail body. It blasted outward, vaporizing the snow within a 100-yard radius. The frozen earth scorched into blackened glass beneath the sheer heat of her awakening. Inside her chest, the phantom ache vanished completely. The rotting gangrene of the betrayal was incinerated, replaced by a roaring, incandescent warmth. Her bones began to crack. It was not the sickening crunch of injury. It was the rhythmic, thunderous shifting of a supreme predator breaking free from a cage. Elena screamed as the ancient power reshaped her anatomy. The sound was not human. It shifted into a guttural, terrifying roar that shook the very foundations of the forest. Her human skin dissolved into thick, shimmering fur the color of spun sunlight. Her muscles expanded, packing with terrifying, lethal strength that defied biological logic. Her jaws elongated into a massive, deadly muzzle lined with razor-sharp teeth. The golden magic smelled like lightning and crushed cedar. It tasted like a brewing storm on her tongue. Her physical senses exploded outward into the night. She could hear the frantic heartbeat of every owl hidden in the canopy miles away. She could smell the exact mineral composition of the earth deep beneath her pores. When the golden wolf finally stood beneath the hollowed weir tree, she dwarfed the largest alpha in recorded history. She was a god-tier entity, a legendary architect of the wild, radiating an aura so intense it made the freezing air ripple with intense heat. The snow around her melted instantly, creating a halo of green, thriving grass in the middle of the dead winter. The phantom wolf spirits that had guarded the border materialized from the shadows. They drifted through the solid trunks of the pine trees, their ethereal bodies composed of swirling silver mist and glowing amber light. These were the spirits of the first Alphas, the original protectors of the realm, bearing ethereal scars from wars fought before the Obsidian Palace was even built. They did not attack. They did not bare their spectral teeth. Dozens of the massive guardians formed a wide circle around the sanctuary. Slowly, with absolute reverence, the spirits lowered their massive heads, pressing their muzzles into the thawing earth. They were bowing to their true sovereign. The golden beast tilted her massive head back toward the bleeding sky. She unleashed a howl that tore the winter clouds apart. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. A declaration that the discarded maid was dead, and the forest had finally crowned its rightful queen. At the exact microsecond, the golden wolf howled in the ancient timberland. A catastrophic sonic boom of spiritual energy struck the Obsidian Palace. The grand throne room had been built to humble kings. Its ceiling vaulted so high that the torchlight could not reach the rafters, and the great wolves of the founding pack stared down from murals worn dim by centuries of incense and grief. 200 candles burned along the colonnades, yet the air inside was freezing, dropping several degrees with every breath the failing Alpha took. King Soren was pacing the length of the grand hall. His breathing was already ragged, his broad shoulders hunched forward as if carrying a physical boulder. The unnatural grey streaks in his dark hair had thickened noticeably in just hours, a visual testament to his rapidly decaying life force. Around him the high court stood in nervous, suffocating silence. No one dared to speak or offer counsel. Lady Cynthia Blackwood hovered near the raised dais, her calculating eyes tracking his every stumble. She wore a gown of crimson silk, attempting to project the image of the undisputed Luna, but her smile was strained. Her ambition had always been a hungry, ugly thing, hidden behind a mask of sweet devotion. Then, the invisible tether snapped. It was not a gentle fading of affection. It was a brutal, violent amputation of the soul. Soren stopped dead in his tracks, his back arched at an unnatural, horrifying angle. A guttural scream ripped from his throat, echoing violently against the vaulted stone ceilings. It was the sound of a man being torn in half. He crashed to his knees on the polished marble floor, his massive hands clawed desperately at his own chest, his thick fingers tearing through his expensive silk tunic to reach the skin directly above his heart. The claiming mark, the sacred runic symbol that had bound his soul to Elena, suddenly flared with a blinding toxic green light. Then it turned pitch black. It sizzled into his flesh like branded iron. The horrific smell of burning skin and rotting magic filled the grand hall, making the nearest nobles gag and cover their mouths. The untouchable ruler was convulsing on the floor, foaming at the lips. His molten amber eyes rolled back into his skull. The spiritual rejection was so absolute, so devastatingly pure, that it triggered a massive physiological collapse within his immortal body. His internal temperature plummeted to freezing. He was dying. The true mate had permanently locked him out of her soul, and his biology could not survive the absolute eviction. Cynthia did not hesitate. The manipulative antagonist saw her window of absolute control slipping away. If the sovereign died on this floor, her grand ambition burned with him. She would be nothing but a rejected, powerless mistress. "Stay back," she shrieked at the approaching royal healers, her voice shrill and desperate. "Only I can soothe him." She dropped to her knees beside the thrashing man. The facade of the sweet, caring childhood sweetheart evaporated instantly. Her perfectly manicured hands hovered over his convulsing chest. Dark, oily mist began to seep from her fingertips. It was forbidden shadow magic, a parasitic, mind-altering spell designed to hijack the empty void in his chest and bind his will to hers permanently. She'd been secretly poisoning him with this dark influence for months, convincing him to discard his true mate. Now she intended to finish the job and seal the throne. "I will anchor you, my king," Cynthia chanted. Her voice dropped an octave into an unnatural, layered distortion that made the elders clutch their ears in pain. The sickly scent of poisoned honey and decaying graveyard flowers flooded the throne room, completely choking out the smell of burning flesh. The dark mist slithered toward his blackened, claiming mark like a cluster of venomous snakes, eager to burrow into the open wound. but the desperate woman had severely miscalculated the nature of the void. She assumed the sudden departure had left the Alpha completely empty. She did not realize that the empty space was currently being flooded by the violent backlash of an awakened god-tier entity across the northern border. The moment the dark magic touched his skin, the residual golden energy from the severed bond reacted autonomously. It acted as a divine immune system, violently rejecting the parasite. A flash of blinding, scorching golden fire erupted directly from the king's chest. It hit Cynthia with the force of a physical battering ram. The impact lifted her off the marble and threw her backward through the air. She crashed violently into a stone pillar, the ancient masonry cracking in a spiderweb pattern behind her back. Her dark spell shattered into millions of useless, smoking fragments that dissolved before hitting the floor. The golden backlash burned her hands raw, leaving her skin charred, blistered, and smoking. She screamed in genuine agony, clutching her ruined fingers against her chest. Her crimson silk gown singed and ruined. The High Court fell into a stunned, horrified silence. The illusion was entirely broken. Several elders drew their silver blades, stepping defensively in front of their own families. The murmurs of horror grew into outright accusations. The elders stared at the groveling, weeping woman, their expressions twisting from political concern to absolute disgust. The sweet, innocent lady they had favored over the quiet, dignified mate was an abomination. She was a dark practitioner. She had been manipulating his mind with shadow spells to steal the golden lichen crest she had not earned. The entire hierarchy of the royal court had been built on a foundation of toxic deceit. Sorin lay on the floor, gasping for shallow breaths, his massive body shivering violently. The golden backlash had saved his mind from her parasitic control, but the physical exertion had left him completely hollowed out. The throne room was silent, save for the pathetic sobbing of the exposed traitor. He was freezing to death from the inside out, and everyone in the room knew they were watching the end of a dynasty. The heavy oak doors of the throne room slammed open, shattering the poisoned silence like a hammer against glass. Commander Garrick Thorne stood in the grand archway. His dark leather armor was covered in thick layers of unmelted frost, a stark contrast to the roaring fireplaces of the palace. His weathered face was pale, his jaw set tightly. His eyes were wide with an emotion the seasoned warrior had never displayed before. Absolute awe. He took in the chaotic, humiliating scene. The weeping, burned antagonist huddled in the corner, clutching her ruined hands. The horrified elders backing away from her in disgust with drawn weapons, and the dying king, the most feared alpha in the southern territories, bleeding and shivering pathetically on the marble floor. Garrick bypassed the panicked nobles without a second glance. The polished floors were slick with melted snow from his heavy boots. He marched directly to the dais and fell to one knee beside his fallen master. His calloused hands gripped the edges of his frozen cloak. He had to deliver the truth, no matter how much it would destroy the man he served. Sorin forced his heavy eyelids open. His amber eyes were dull, clouded with unimaginable physical pain. His cracked lips parted, trying to form her name, but all that came out was a pathetic, wheezing breath that plumed in the freezing air immediately surrounding his face. The ambient temperature of the room was plummeting, simply because his core was dying. The loyal soldier did not wait for a royal command. He reported his failure, his deep voice carrying through the silent hall like a death knell. He spoke of the harsh journey to the border. He described the phantom wolf spirits that had blocked their path, the ancient guardians composed of silver mist and golden light that protected the exiled mate with absolute lethal intent. But his voice shook when he recounted the final moment. He described how the night sky had suddenly turned a violent crimson, how the earth had quaked beneath his boots, and how a light had erupted from the very heart of the forest. A golden aura so massive, so intensely hot, that it vaporized the blizzard entirely, turning the falling snow into hissing steam. The ambient magic was suffocating, Garrick explained softly, his gaze locked on the king's failing eyes. It was like looking directly into the sun. It forced me to drop my weapon. I could not stand against it. It was not the energy of an exiled Omega. It was not the desperate survival of a broken wolf. The commander swallowed hard, forcing himself to deliver the final crushing blow to the arrogant Alpha's reality. "It was the Golden Wolf, my king. We did not banish a weakling. You discarded the true sovereign of the wild." The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Several elders gasped aloud, taking involuntary steps backward in pure terror. The Golden Wolf was a myth. A god-tier manifestation of ancient magic, said to only awaken once every 1,000 years to restore balance to a corrupted world, and they had mocked her. They had treated her like dirt. They had stood in this very room and snickered while she was publicly humiliated. On the cold marble floor, Sorin stopped shivering. The agonizing truth finally penetrated his thick, arrogant wall of pride. The scales fell from his eyes. All the manipulation, all the political maneuvering with the woman crying in the corner, all of it had been for absolutely nothing. An accident implies a lack of knowledge, but a conscious choice means proceeding with eyes wide open, fully embracing the damage. The damning realization crushed his windpipe. He had allowed Cynthia's dark magic to whisper in his ear, but he was the one who had spoken the words of rejection. He was the one who had publicly demanded she accept a secondary position. He remembered the quiet dignity of his mate, the way she had never raised her voice, yet somehow always anchored his volatile temper. He remembered the soft, clean scent of moonflower that used to linger on her skin, now replaced by the sickening stench of burning rot in his own chest. He had traded a living goddess for a manipulative parasite, and now karma had arrived to collect its bloody debt. Sorin tried to push himself up. His thick arms shook violently under his own weight. He managed to lift his torso, coughing up a mouthful of dark, rotting blood onto the pristine white marble. A few loyal elders rushed forward to assist him, extending their hands, but he raised a trembling fist, waving them away violently. He did not deserve their help. He did not deserve his crown. The crippling cold inside his chest was a constant, excruciating reminder of the radiant warmth he had voluntarily extinguished. "Send the healers away," Sorin wheezed. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it echoed with the weight of absolute, soul-crushing despair. He looked at the kneeling commander, his cloudy amber eyes filling with tears of profound, sickening regret. "Do not send another soldier." "My king, you cannot survive the night in this state," Garrick warned, his tone strictly objective, but edged with genuine, heavy concern. "The bond is completely gone. You are bleeding out spiritually. If you do not receive magical intervention, your heart will freeze before dawn." "I know," the broken king croaked. He dragged his heavy body upward, refusing assistance, leaning heavily against the golden base of the throne he had once prized above all else. It felt like worthless, cold metal now. It meant nothing without the silver crescent, pendant she had quietly left upon it. "If I send an army, the forest will slaughter them. If I demand her return as an alpha, the magic will turn me to ash." He clutched his ruined chest, his fingers digging mercilessly into the blackened, dead claiming mark. The runic scar was cold now, dead tissue. The realization was absolute and horrifying. There was no political maneuver left to save him. There was no army strong enough to force her back into his life. He had to cross the frozen wasteland. He had to enter the heavy mists of the forbidden territory, entirely stripped of his royal protection, the golden lichen crest, and his pride. "I would rather burn with you than freeze alone." The frantic, terrified thought echoed in his fading mind as he stared out the tall glass windows toward the distant, dark tree line of the whispering woods. "I must go," Sorin whispered to the empty, vaulted ceiling, his tears finally spilling over his hollowed cheeks. The once powerful sovereign looked like a pathetic, ruined shadow of a man. His arrogance had been entirely stripped away, leaving only raw, desperate remorse. He knew he would probably not survive the journey. He knew the spectral lupine guardians would crush his physical strength before he even reached the sanctuary. But he had to look her in the eyes one last time. He had to crawl to the very dirt he had forced her to sleep on, and he had to beg. The heavy mists of the Forbidden Realm swallowed the dying man whole. Sorin stumbled across the invisible border, his ruined chest heaving with every agonizing breath. The temperature here was not merely weather. It was a sentient, suffocating pressure designed to crush intruders into the damp earth. The snow at the edge of the tree line had turned to a thick, freezing slush that soaked through his ruined silk tunic and expensive leather trousers. He had no royal guards to carve a path. He had no sweeping velvet cloak to shield his broad shoulders from the biting wind. The fallen Alpha was entirely alone, armed with nothing but the rotting black scar directly over his heart. The dead claiming mark pulsed with a sickening, heavy rhythm. It felt as though a jagged shard of dry ice had been driven between his ribs, slowly freezing his vital organs from the inside out. Soren coughed, spitting a mixture of dark blood and saliva onto the roots of an ancient weir tree. His legs, once capable of carrying him through days of brutal warfare, buckled entirely. He crashed to his knees. The impact sent a shockwave of raw agony up his spine, but he did not stop moving. He dragged his heavy body forward. His bare hands clawed at the frozen dirt and decaying pine needles. The physical pain was severe, but it paled in comparison to the soul-crushing humiliation of his own mind. He had done this to himself. The ambient magic of the forest actively rejected his presence. The atmospheric pressure tripled with every yard he crawled deeper into the forbidden territory. The air grew so dense it felt like breathing underwater. Above him, the thick canopy of blackened branches swayed, though there was no wind. The shadows between the massive trunks began to twist and lengthen. Glowing amber eyes ignited in the absolute darkness. The phantom wolf spirits had arrived. They did not growl. They did not snap their spectral jaws. They simply watched the once feared ruler drag himself through the mud like a wounded insect. The ancient spirits were letting the environment serve as his judge and executioner. His vision began to blur, the edges of his sight turning a fuzzy, hollow grey. The cold inside his chest was absolute now. His heart was slowing down, the beats spreading further and further apart. He pressed his forehead against the wet soil, his fingers digging into a patch of freezing moss. "I am sorry." The thought was a pathetic, soundless echo in his fading mind. He could not even muster the breath to speak the apology aloud. The arrogance that had fueled his entire reign had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified hollow shell of a man who just wanted to see her face as one last time. Then the oppressive darkness fractured. A blinding, incandescent light erupted from the dense fog directly ahead of him. The ambient temperature spiked violently, turning the freezing slush beneath his bleeding fingers into hissing steam. The heavy scent of crushed cedar and raw lightning flooded his ruined senses, violently chasing away the smell of his own decaying magic. The ruined sovereign forced his heavy eyelids open. He tilted his chin upward, his breath catching in his throat. A massive beast stepped out of the swirling mist. The creature was gargantuan, her shoulders easily clearing the lowest branches of the ancient pines. Her fur shimmered like spun sunlight, radiating a heat so intense it stung his frost-bitten skin. The golden wolf did not walk. She glided with the terrifying, majestic grace of a supreme predator. Her molten eyes locked onto the pathetic, shivering figure in the dirt. There was no hesitation in her approach. There was no mercy in her gaze. Soren tried to lift his hands in a gesture of absolute surrender, but his muscles completely failed him. The beast closed the distance in two massive, silent strides. She loomed over him, blotting out the crimson glow of the blood moon above. Then she raised one massive paw and pressed it directly onto the center of his chest. The sheer physical weight was astronomical. The dying man was instantly pinned flat to the damp earth, the breath violently expelled from his lungs. The heavy paw rested squarely over his blackened claiming mark, yet, instead of crushing his ribcage into splinters, the contact sent a shocking, agonizing surge of searing heat straight into his frozen heart. It was a violent reminder of the supreme power she now wielded. He lay completely paralyzed beneath the massive golden beast, staring up at the terrifying god-tier entity he had once called a worthless Omega. He did not struggle. He did not fight the suffocating pressure. He closed his eyes and willingly offered his throat to the true sovereign of the wild. The beast maintained her crushing hold for a long, agonizing minute. The heat radiating from her massive body was the only thing keeping the fallen king's heart beating. Then, the blinding light surrounding her physical form began to shift. It was not the grotesque, bone-snapping process of a standard shifter returning to their human state. It was a fluid, divine contraction of raw energy. The massive wolf dissolved into a swirling vortex of golden mist and crackling ozone. The crushing weight on his chest vanished, leaving him gasping desperately for the suddenly warm air. He rolled onto his side, his large frame shaking uncontrollably as he clutched his ruined tunic. He forced himself to look up through the dissipating fog. The woman standing before him bore no resemblance to the quiet, submissive mate he had publicly discarded in his own hall. Elena Silverwood stood tall and unbroken against the backdrop of the ancient pines. The simple silk and silver she had worn on the day of her humiliation were gone. In their place, the awakened magic of the forest had manifested into magnificent armor. The plating was forged from hardened, glowing gold, contouring perfectly to her body. Ethereal, shimmering runes were etched into the metal, pulsing with the exact rhythm of the earth beneath their feet. Her pale, quiet features were now striking and immortal, framed by hair that glowed with a faint, stellar luminescence. She held no weapon, yet she exuded an aura of absolute, lethal authority. She was a living goddess of the woods. The sight of her completely broke whatever fragile, pathetic remains of pride the dying man held onto. Sorin wept. The great and terrifying ruler of the northern stronghold, a man who had commanded thousands of warriors and executed enemies without a flinch, openly sobbed in the dirt. The tears cut clean tracks through the mud and dried blood on his hollowed face. The physical relief of her proximity was intoxicating, fighting a desperate war against the decaying frost in his veins. But the emotional devastation of recognizing the magnificent, peerless value of what he had casually thrown away was a torture worse than death. He dragged his heavy, ruined body forward. His bleeding fingers clawed at the thawed soil until he reached the toes of her armored boots. He collapsed forward, pressing his forehead directly into the mud at her feet. It was the ultimate, absolute grovel. The Sovereign Alpha submitting entirely to the woman he had wronged. "Forgive me," the broken man gasped, his voice cracking. Entirely stripped of its deep, commanding resonance, he sounded like a terrified, begging child. "Please, I was blind. I was poisoned by my own arrogance. I let Lady Cynthia Blackwood and her forbidden shadow magic cloud my mind, but the choice was mine. The fault is mine. Punish me, break my bones, burn my flesh. But please, do not let me freeze in this dark." The armored goddess did not move. She did not flinch at the sound of his weeping. She stood as perfectly still as a marble statue, looking down at the broad, shaking shoulders of her former husband. He reached into the folds of his ruined cloak with a violently trembling hand. He pulled free the heavy, solid gold circle of his royal authority. He held the golden lichen crest out, offering the symbol of his entire dynasty to the quiet woman standing above him. His fingers were turning blue from the residual rot in his chest, his breath puffing into the air in desperate, shallow gasps. "Have it," the ruined sovereign begged, his amber eyes wide, bloodshot and fixed on her radiant face. "Have the palace. Keep the high court. I will yield the entire kingdom to you. I will slaughter anyone who questions your rule. I will sleep on the stone floor at the foot of your throne. Just speak my name. Please, Elena, say my name just once. Heal this rot." The silence that followed his desperate plea was deafening. The ambient hum of the forest seemed to pause, waiting for the golden weaver to pass her judgment. Sorin held his breath, the heavy crown shaking in his hands, his entire existence hanging on the precipice of her next word. He expected anger. He expected a righteous, furious declaration of vengeance. He expected her to kick the crest from his bleeding hands and watch him die. When Elena finally spoke, her voice contained no rage. There was no hatred, no lingering bitterness, and no petty triumph. It was calm, it was ancient. It echoed with the harmonic resonance of the phantom wolf spirits that guarded her borders. "You offer me a prison of stone," the sovereign stated softly. Her golden eyes flicked down to the heavy crown in his trembling hands, viewing the priceless artifact as if it were a piece of rusted scrap metal. "You offer me the very hierarchy that demanded my silence. You believe a title and a throne can compensate for the absolute rot of your betrayal." The dying man choked on a sob, his head dropping lower until his cheek rested against the wet earth. The cold in his chest spiked, a terrifying reminder that his biological clock was seconds away from completely stopping. He had nothing else to offer. He had laid his entire world at her feet, and she had correctly identified it as worthless. I do not want your palace, the Golden Wolf continued, her tone ringing with absolute, unshakable finality. She took a single, deliberate step back, removing herself from his immediate reach. I will not return to a court that snickered while you broke my spirit. I am not a prize to be won back through suffering. I am not a secondary option to be installed when your primary ambition fails. A mistake is when you do not know what you are doing. A choice is when you do, and you do it anyway. You made your choice at the altar. She paused, letting the crushing weight of her reality settle over the shivering Alpha. The ambient magic of the forest flared around her, a visual manifestation of her absolute independence. Not used, not owned, chosen. The absolute decree struck him harder than any physical blow. They were an irrefutable declaration of her worth, a standard he had catastrophically failed to meet. He squeezed his eyes shut, his massive frame convulsing as the freezing death finally reached the outer walls of his heart. He was going to die here, in the mud, holding a meaningless crown. However, the ancient sovereign whispered, her voice slicing through the heavy mist, "The true mate bond requires balance. You severed it with arrogance. If you wish to survive the night, you must restore the balance with absolute, permanent submission." His eyes snapped open. He stared up at her through his tears, a desperate, pathetic spark of hope igniting in the dark void of his mind. He did not care about the terms. He did not care about the cost. "I demand that you surrender your crown," Elena commanded, her gaze piercing straight through his soul. "Not to me, to the earth. You will strip yourself of your title. You will remain in this forbidden territory, not as King Sorin Valerius, but as a servant of the woods. You will guard these borders. You will tend to the sanctuary you once tried to drag me away from. You will never sit on a throne again." The condition was an absolute, permanent role reversal. The most feared ruler in the southern territories was being ordered to become a nameless sentry in the dirt. He was being asked to abandon his legacy, his wealth, and his absolute authority, all for the privilege of simply breathing the same air as the woman he had discarded. Sorin did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. With a ragged, desperate exhale, the fallen man released his grip on the golden lichen crest. The heavy metal dropped into the damp mud, instantly sinking into the decaying pine needles. He laid his empty hands flat against the freezing earth, pressing his forehead into the dirt one final time. He was no longer the ruler of the Obsidian Palace. He was nothing, and in that absolute, empty surrender, he finally found the bottom of his pride. "I yield," the broken man whispered. "I am yours to command, always." The moment the genuine vow of submission left his lips, the armored goddess stepped forward. She did not embrace him. She did not offer a tearful reunion. She simply reached down and pressed the glowing tip of her index finger against the blackened, rotting scar over his heart. A single, concentrated spark of golden fire shot into his chest. Sorin gasped violently, his back arching off the ground. The agonizing cold within his veins shattered instantly. The physical rot halted, his lungs expanded, drawing in a massive, unobstructed breath of freezing night air. The gangrene of the severed bond receded, replaced by a dull, manageable ache. He was not completely healed. The claiming mark would remain black and dead forever, a permanent physical reminder of the choice he had made. But he was no longer dying. The parasitic frost had been banished. He collapsed back into the mud, panting heavily, his massive chest rising and falling with the beautiful, agonizing rhythm of life. He opened his amber eyes, intending to thank her, intending to swear his eternal loyalty to the sovereign who had granted him mercy, but she was already walking away. Elena did not look back. The glowing runes on her gold plating illuminated the dense fog as she moved deeper into the sanctuary of the untamed wilds. The ethereal pack parted silently to let their queen pass, their spectral eyes turning back to watch the shivering, nameless man left behind in the dirt. He watched her leave, like a man watching his own heart walk out of his chest. The profound silence of the forest settled over him, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. The crown lay rusting in the mud beside his hand. The Obsidian Palace was a lifetime away, a hollow memory of a foolish boy who had thought he could rule the world without the sun. He was a servant now, a guardian of the shadows, and as he pressed his hand over the dead scar on his chest, he knew it was the greatest honor he would ever achieve. The frost never returned to the high halls, and if you listen closely to the winter wind, you can still hear the echo of a king who learned that the greatest power is not a crown, but a choice. Thank you for listening to this story. If the warmth of this tale reached you, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in her place? Until the next moon, keep the magic alive.